Okay, so in this video we are going to be rebuilding the Mini A-Series gearbox. Okay, so I've now moved on to the case, and the first bits, I'm obviously following a Haynes manual, the first bits it says to put in are these two bits. So I'm going to oil those and slide them in the bottom. That does give a note saying that you shouldn't put it in the correct position, because obviously this should be pointed towards the post, but it does say aim it away. I'm guessing that's to get the main shaft in. The next bit it says to put in is the selector mechanism here. So I've got them all tie wrapped so I didn't lose the position. I'll clean them up and put them in one by one. Okay, so start with the little top hat. Then we're going to move on to the reverse selector. Like so. And then build it up bit by bit. So there's a nice little washer there. Another washer. Another selector. It's obviously very important that these all go in the right place, because I've got like chamfers and one is longer than the other. Okay, so they're in. Finish it off with a washer. And then the nut. Okay, so now it's time to get the selector forks in on their shafts. So the first one we'll put in is 3rd and 4th. Give that a bit of a oil. Shove that somewhere like that. Oh, I don't know. Like that. I'll get the next one. Go in like so. And then we're going to get the shaft and put that in. It's a bit fiddly this, and I'm not sure if my hands are going to be in the way. You must, as you can see, get that lined up on the fork. So on the operating lever. Same with this one. There we go. And we're aiming to get this hole in the shaft lined up so we can put the pin back in. Get that pin back in. So that's now in. So now it's time to put the reverse idler in. Make sure it lines up on its post, and we should be able to feed the shaft through. Making sure that slot is at the top, it says. There we go. So let's put the oil strainer back in. So before you put it in, it says just lubricate the O-ring that's down there, just to help you put the pipe back in. So that goes in something like that. So I've put that in, but it says don't put the bolts in, so I won't. It then says main shaft in, so here's the important bit. So I'm going to take off the first motion. And try and get this in. So we've now got to put this whole assembly back in. But it's important that we get this bit and that bit in the selector forks. No, already failing. Actually, that wasn't too hard. So now I've got to fit the main bearing, and I've transferred the clip from the old bearing to this new one. So I'm going to lubricate that, and then I'll slide that on and tap it in. So I'm just going to drift that in, see if it will go. Okay, so that sounds like it's nicely in. Okay, so I've got that bearing in, but as you can see I've got a big gap here. So I'm guessing I need to put the nut back on to pull that shaft through. Okay, so the next stage, once you've put that bearing on there, is to push this bearing onto the first motion. So I'm going to find a drift that pushes on that inner race. Okay, so that bearing's now drifted into place. Make sure you've got the bulk ring in there, and then we'll put this into place. And what I can remember, this wasn't too tight, so hopefully that'll tap in. Okay, so I just need to tap that in fully so I can put the circlip on. Okay, so the next part of the build was to put in the lay shaft. I've got a brand new shaft and bearings at either end. And I've got the thrust washers here at either end. So you put it all in place, and then you've got to measure that end float. And you're meant to shim it if necessary. So I'm going to measure that and see what it comes out at. It seems to be quite a lot of movement there. Okay, so it's actually the next day now. The lay shaft needed quite a sizable shim. I think I had a gap of about 11 thousandths of an inch, and the tolerance was between 2 and 6, so I've actually put an 8 thou shim behind the big one back here. Turns out you can't actually get, or I couldn't see if you can actually get any more of these thrust washers. Normally you change the bigger one for a different size one, that's what the Haynes manual says, but in my case I couldn't find them. So I'll put shim behind that one, and now it's made it nice and tight. There's about a 2 thou clearance remaining. So the next part for me was to install this, and the Haynes manual says put it in, and then put it in minus the shims, and then measure the clearance, and then add shims to make it correct. Along with that, you also need to really put that, because that goes in that corner there. However, I don't know which way around it goes. But what I found is that this won't fit in the slot at the end of the shaft. So very carefully I'm having to file this down so it fits in the slot. So that's my next little task. Okay, so I've just moved the camera to showing the end of the gearbox. I'll just zoom out so you can see what I'm talking about. So that's the end of the gearbox. This is the output end. Zoom back in, get it to focus. Thank you. And the next bit, as explained previously, is to fit this. So I've managed to get that retainer bracket in there so it slots nicely in the two shafts, and now I can mount the bearing retainer in and tighten that up and see what the clearance is. Okay, so I'm measuring the clearance down here in between this plate and the casing, and where this it's not actually a missing bolt, it's actually where the lock tab washer goes in. You can see this feeler gauge will slide nicely down there. Now that's actually two feeler gauges, that's actually a 3 and a 4 thousandths of an inch, so that is 7 thou will fit quite nicely. It will also fit down this gap here so you can check that it is even. So 7 thousandths fit, change that to 8. So this is 8, and you'll see that 8 really does not fit anymore, just the slightest tip goes in on that corner. So I now know I need 7 thousandths of an inch to take up that gap. The original shims that I had do actually just still fit nicely in there, so that would suggest those original shims are perfect for the gap that I've got. The whole purpose of the shims is to take up this gap so that this doesn't just solely push up against the bearing. What you want to achieve is that when you tighten the retaining bolts, this is tightening against the case and the bearing with equal force. So now I've got the right shims, or I can reuse the original. I can now take this plate off and put the shims back in and put the lock washers on and tighten everything up correctly. So before I put the retainer back in and bolt it up, you'll note that the shims which I've put in place do actually fit underneath that. Okay, so I'm just torquing these up, and the Haynes manual says that the main bearing retaining bolts are 13 foot-pounds. And just to demonstrate, I've nipped this up, just nipped it up, and I'll now go on the torque wrench. So it's not very much at all, and you have to remember this is an aluminium casing. You really don't want to be horsing these up. So again, I'll try and work out the angle. It's not even a quarter of a turn, it's barely an eighth of a turn from nipped up. So 13 foot-pounds is all they need to go, and then you're going to have to knock over the lock or the tab washers. So the next stage is to fit this final drive pinion, followed by a new tab washer. There we go, and then the nuts. So the really awkward bit is getting that nut tight, and the Haynes manual tells us to put it into first and fourth gear. That will actually lock the gears from turning, and then we should be able to tighten that nut up. I'm going to have to do that in the garage, so I will rearrange the camera. So before I relocate to the garage, I will just point out how to engage the gears. So it does tell you to engage first, which is this synchronizer to that gear, and fourth, which is that synchronizer to the first motion. Let's try and do that. Quite hard to achieve. So there you go, that one went quite nicely. The other one's a bit more awkward. There it goes. There it goes. So that is now engaged. Come on, a bit more. Okay, so that's gone fully on now. So that is fourth gear engaged and first gear engaged. Okay, so I don't know how clear this is going to be, but hopefully you can see I've got the gearbox, and I've got this bit of wood here. Now that is securely screwed to the wall, and that's allowing me to put quite a lot of force on the gearbox and stop it from turning. So I've got up to 100 without too much problem. I'm now going to go to 120 and see what happens. Glasses at the ready. Okay, so that's 120. We've got to go to 150 on this. So let's just give that a try. Okay, so I've managed to get to 120. I'll just load this up a bit more and hopefully we'll get to the 150. It's worth noting that 150 foot-pounds is the maximum my torque wrench will actually go. And this is really quite a lot of force. Okay, so that is looking good. That's 140. Let's just wind it up to 150. Right, last go. There we go. That was very successful. Now all I need to do is lock that tab washer, and that's that end done. I think that the next stage will be to do the other end. Okay, so I've got the socket in place. That is a 1 1/8 inch socket as opposed to the 1 1/2 for the other end. And I've just put it on a 3/8 drive, which maxes out at 40 foot-pounds. So I've got a block of steel here underneath just to support everything, mainly because this nut is so thin that you can quite easily do that. So I'm going to have to be very careful with this one. There we go. Right, so I'm now going to go up to the 1/2 inch drive and pile on some force. Okay, that's 60. Go up to 80. $100. So far so good. 120. I think this is the worst part of this rebuild, getting these tight. $120, come on. There it is. $140. There we go. I'll stand on it this time. Hasn't clicked yet. That's worrying. There we go. And final bit, 150. There we go, 150. Worst bit done. Okay, so I had a really good evening yesterday getting those two main nuts done up, and as you can see I've bent over the tab washers there, and then on the other one back here. Focus, thank you. Okay, so the next stage, it tells us just to rotate the selector back into the right position. As you can see, it is pointing left at the moment. It needs to be pointing all the way around, so you need to do a little bit of wiggling to get it in place. There you go, that is now in the correct position. Okay, so the next bit of the build is to put the bearing back on and then refit the circlip. Okay, so that's the bearing drifted back on. I just used a socket for that, and that's the circlip fitted. So that bit's now done. I'm going to reset the camera up on the tripod so we can do the oil tube. Okay, so for me the first bit is to get the mesh pickup fixed back down to that bracket. So I've got 2 screws for that. I'm not going to do them up really tight. Okay, so I've left this a bit loose. The reason being I need to get the end of this pickup tube into the hole in the filter down the bottom. I also need to make sure that this flange, which I've cleaned up, fits on that face there with a new gasket. That is the oil pipe in position. There's a gasket on that side and a gasket on this side. Okay, so the last task in the Haynes manual is to refit what they call the gearbox front cover. So I've already put the speedo drive into that section, or the gear that drives the speedo drive, I suppose it would be called. That has a new gasket in it, and I've also put Hylomar on both sides of the gasket. I'm going to do the same with this, Hylomar on both sides. I really do not want this engine to leak oil. Okay, so that is the gearbox cover, or front cover, back on and torqued up. The torque settings for these fasteners is actually very low. It's actually only 6 foot-pounds. You need to be very careful because obviously there's a setting for UNC, which is unified coarse, or UNF, unified fine. Because these are in aluminium, they are the coarse fittings and they are a very low torque setting, again because they're in aluminium. If you try to tighten them too much, you'll probably just strip the aluminium red. So what I've done is I've tightened those all up. I'll then leave it for a good half an hour, maybe even an hour, and then re-tighten them all again because that Hylomar will squeeze out of the joint, and it's worth tightening them all up again. Okay, so the last bit to do on this front cover is install the speedo drive, and I've got a gasket for that as well. Okay, so that's installed. Okay, so that is all I'm going to do on this video. Obviously I need to put the differential back on, but I'm going to save that for another video. This video has become too long already. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed watching it. I hope it's been of use to some of you, and please subscribe for some more mini footage. Thank you.